Burnout is this three-part syndrome of being chronically exhausted, being cynical, distant, sort of disengaged with the emotional tones of your work, and being discouraged, sort of losing your sense of efficacy. So that's this experience. Now, it is aggravated by stress. Stress is really the person's reaction to the pressures of life, the pressures of not having enough time, and it involves being tense physically, having a lot of tension psychologically as well. So that is sort of a reaction to demands that contributes to burnout. Like basically, you look at burnout as sort of the downstream result of stress that hasn't been well managed.
Are you feeling exhausted before you even start working? Are you wondering what is the difference between stress and burnout? Are you a leader concerned about your team's turnover rate and looking to make sure that you foster a long-term culture of performance and loyalty? If these questions resonate with you, this episode is just for you. I am deeply honored to have Dr. Michael Leiter with us today, world-leading researcher on the topic of burnout, co-author of the Burnout Challenge with Christina Malzak, published by Harvard University Press, and professor of organizational psychology. Dr. Michael Leiter is going to enlighten us on the topic of burnout. Welcome to the show.
Wonderful to be here, Charlene. Very good to
And
be
it's
here.
wonderful to have you. I really wanted to start off by asking you a question that I hear so often. Is there a difference, in your expert opinion, between burnout and stress?
Yes, is a short answer. The difference is that burnout is this combination. Burnout is this three-part syndrome of being chronically exhausted, being cynical, distant, sort of disengaged with you know, emotional tones of your work, and being discouraged, sort of losing your sense of efficacy. So that's this particular experience. Now, it is aggravated by stress. Stress is really the person's reaction to the pressures of life, the pressures of not having enough time, other kinds of various demands upon you, and it involves being tense physically, having a lot of tension psychologically as well. So that is sort of a reaction to demands that contributes to burnout. Like basically, you look at burnout as sort of the downstream result of stress that hasn't been well managed. And so it's sort of burnout sort of further down the stream, and it is this sort of ongoing experience of just feeling exhausted and cynical and discouraged.
Mm. And you've mentioned this psychological element, which I think is so important to dive into. In your expert opinion, as a psychologist, do you think that there are traits, psychological traits, that will predispose one to burnout?
Some of them are actually fairly positive traits, and that
Mm.
people are people who are really conscientious and really care about their work and are really involved in it, they're more vulnerable to burnout because they're putting more of their heart into their work in that way. So, which is something you want people to be able to do. So you don't want to say, well, let's not hire any conscientious people. That could get you into trouble, a different kind of trouble as an employer. So that kind of quality is something that is actually a positive quality, but it sort of gets away a little bit. Um, Folks who are more prone to worrying a lot, perhaps have, more of a tendency towards burnout. But really, burnout is much more about the situation people are working in, and it has less to do with their personality in that way.
Mm. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I know you specialize in organizational psychology, and perhaps for some of our listeners that are not too familiar with this concept, could you walk us through what is organizational psychology to begin with, and how does it interplay with burnout prevention measures?
Well, organizational psychology looks at people within certain kinds of settings. And the idea sort of goes back to a psychologist, Roger Barker, who said, well, uh, if I tell you that a person is in a bookstore, you can predict a lot more of what they're doing than if I tell you a person is an extrovert. Like if they're at a bookstore, there's certain things people are going to be doing. It sort of narrows the field. People really are interacting with their settings all the time. And work settings are fairly structured environments. They tend to stay a lot the same, much more the same over time than they change. So they have some evolution. So it's organizational psychology is basically work psychology. How do people function within workplaces? What are the crises that they encounter? What are the joys that they experience? What's that all about? So you're looking at this relationship between a person and the environment in which they're spending a big part of their lives, like a whole lot of your waking hours, and your waking hours where you're trying to actually accomplish something, aspiring towards actually, doing great things. So you've got this idea that you've got a environment, a person, and people enter work environments with certain psychological motives. They want to get fulfilled in a certain way. One is a sense of belonging. People want to belong to a group. They want to have a social group that they feel part of, that they're valued in, that people care about them. They want that when they go to work. They're part of a community that respects them and looks after them to a degree. People want to have their sense of efficacy confirmed. They want to going to work feeling like, I'm pretty good at this, and that getting confirmation that they're capable and that they're significant contributors. And they also have a motive to be somewhat autonomous, not necessarily all by themselves in that way, but autonomous in that there are at least sometimes at work that you feel like you're the one that's starting things. You're the one that's initiating. You're the one that's making things happen. And you're not always on the receiving end of somebody else's agenda. So those are sort of core psychological motives that people bring, and they're particularly relevant to work. So the question is, does the work setting allow people to fulfill those motives, or is it getting in the way? Is there a mismatch between the person, what the people are trying to accomplish, and what the workplace wants people to do, and how they're shaping their opportunities? And that, to me, that is one of the really important tensions if you want to understand burnout. It's not so much that people want to have a great sense of accomplishment. That's not a bad thing. The question is, does that intersect well with the workplace? Is the workplace encouraging that, fulfilling that, allowing that to happen, or is it keeping them constrained? That kind of thing.
So in your opinion, perhaps that's a very tough question if we were to put numbers on it, but what would be the sort of responsibility if we were to share it in terms of the organization or the workplace and the individual in the journey to burnout prevention or being burnt out? How much is the individual versus the organization responsible for that? I know that's a tough question.
Well, I think it's, you could say the first, it's about half, it's fairly equal. I think they each are carrying some responsibility here. And like one thing, there's this multi-level kind of analysis that's been done on burnout, and they look at to what extent is the variation in people's, big sample, you got a lot of people who are experiencing burnout. To what extent is that variation due to the place that they're working, their work setting? And to what extent is it really an individual thing? And what you'll find, like you go to a hospital, it has very different work environments. Like an emergency room is really different from medical records where they're just keeping track of files. And so you'll find that, the emergency room is going to have much higher exhaustion than the medical records place. But so there's a difference that just because of the work setting, there's going to be a big difference. But then there's a second difference. Within each setting, there's going to be some people who are more exhausted than others and less exhausted than others. And so there's these two different levels. And what you find is about half of the difference in the burnout scores is tied to the setting, and the other half is within the people within those settings. So you find there's something about the person, there's something about the setting. But basically, when you've got a relationship problem, it's a shared problem, and both parties need to be working on it. Like if you have a personal relationship with somebody and you say, we've got a problem, you can't just tell your partner, go away and fix yourself and come back, and then we'll be okay. So say, no, we got to work this out together. We got to talk. We got to find a new way to be together. It's the same thing with workplaces. Like there needs to be a dialogue, and people need to be able to adapt to the workplace as it is. But workplaces need to accommodate people the way they are, particularly the kind of profession you're in with the legal profession. You want people who have a lot of initiative, who have a lot of ideas, who have some creative capacity and be articulate. There's a lot of features you're wanting people to bring out. You want them to be engaged. You want them to think, this is the kind of work that's really fulfilling for me. This is something that I can make things happen, and it's really going to work well in my life to make things happen there. So the setting and the person need to be working together.
And I'm so glad that you're mentioning fulfillment, because I think that it plays such a big part in the burnout prevention equation. And I see that a lot in my clients as well, that when the sense of fulfillment begins to fade, then the risk for burnout starts to increase quite dramatically.
Yeah, you can put a lot of energy into work that you really believe in, and it's just keeps carrying you along. But doing work that you think is a tedious waste of time, filling out travel claims or doing online training modules that don't actually teach you anything. People really get that kind of stuff just drains energy and makes you tired and doesn't really give you anything back. So when people are finding something that really aligns with their values, their professional values, their personal values, and also is furthering things at work, that kind of activity can carry people along much, much further than just, stuff that doesn't really matter to them.
And one question that I have is, considering all your experience with that organizational psychological element, what are some of the most powerful strategies that you've seen implement successfully across different industries and different organizations? In other words, if we had someone listening in today, being the manager or the leader at a large corporation, wanting to really look after their team proactively and make sure that they prevent burnout effectively, are there key measures that you would recommend that person to start considering?
Well, it's a couple of things. One, we always like to start with doing some kind of assessment of the setting and find out what is their particular issue. Like we talk about these 6 areas of work life, one of which is workload. But then closely aligned with that is a sense of control. To what extent do people feel like they're micromanaged and really constrained, or that they have some kind of choice, some kind of control in how they run their work life? Third one is their sense of reward. Are they doing stuff that they think is intrinsically rewarding and meaningful, or are they just doing drudgery that they just find really unpleasant? The third is a sense of community. How are the team getting along? How are people functioning with each other? Fourth is fairness, a sense of justice at work. Are you convinced that that's there? And sixth is this idea of value congruence, that my values and the organization's are in line with each other. So any or all of those can have a mismatch, such that people just think this is just wrong. And sometimes there's multiple mismatches. Sometimes there's just one big one. You want to be able to identify one that is both important to people. You find that there are a lot of people who are having trouble with maybe a sense of community. Like they're looking for being part of a really supportive, creative team, but they find they're just with a bunch of people who are a bunch of duds that don't talk to each other or actually even rude to each other instead of supporting each other. So maybe that's an issue in some places, but it's not an issue in every place. So you don't want to just start working on something until you know that's. And then second quality, one, it's an important issue. Secondly, it's something you can change, that you're willing to change, that you as a leader in the organization saying, okay, we're willing to change something here to make this a better workplace. If you're not willing to change anything, you're better off not even asking the question because you'll just make people unhappy. So if you've got to ask the question, then you got to figure, okay, here is something we're willing to make some changes. So with that as a background, something I've been working on of late has been looking at sort of the social dynamics among members of work teams. That we find that people who are experiencing burnout, one, they're reporting a lot of negative social encounters with other people, maybe maybe conflict, but maybe just really subtle things like people don't say good morning to them when they say good morning to, they're not responding to them, or they're taking credit for their ideas or things like that. But it's a really unpleasant kind of social environment that people who are experiencing burnout are having a lot more of those kinds of encounters. And they're also acknowledging that they're not really very nice to other people either because they're exhausted and they're cynical and they're really discouraged. It's not hard to be nice when you're feeling that way. So basically it becomes this self-perpetuating kind of cycle. And so what we do is we basically call it doing family therapy with work groups. And because with family therapy, people want to say, oh, the child has a problem, and they take this child to the psychologist. And the psychologist, no, we got to talk together. I can't just work with the child. It's a child. What we need to do as a family is find out what's going on with the tension and the relationships here and finding a way of building something more positive. And that's what we do with work groups. We say, what's going on with here? We go, in the past month, how often has your supervisor expressed appreciation to you for the work that you do? How often has a colleague expressed appreciation to you for the work? How often have you expressed appreciation to other people for the work that they do? Let's just get on the positive side. How much positive stuff is happening? And then we also ask, well, how often has somebody, said something really rude and disrespectful to you? Your supervisor or a colleague. Well, how often do you say rude, disrespectful things to other people? So you get this sort of map of what's going on in terms of the social dynamics of the team. And some of them, most people get along fine, but some places, they're really having a difficult time. And it's a desert in terms of trying to get a sense of belonging. So we say, okay, people can control that. We can teach people, and people can, make a commitment that they're going to be more positive when they interact with other people. They're going to put some effort into it. Come on. So we start doing that. Get a commitment, get the group working together. And it's a group process. It's like a work group that's working together. It's not like a training. It's more like doing family therapy. We're talking a number of sessions in a row about, well, how do we talk to each other? How do we support each other? How do we be rude to each other? And let's start changing that so it's more positive. And in that way, we're not singling out and saying, well, there's one bad person who's rude to people. We're saying, actually, we're a place where people are rude to each other and we're not liking it. So let's see if we can change that. If you do that, and data shows that if you improve the percentage of real positivity in these interactions, that the indicators on particularly exhaustion and cynicism, they change and things get more positive over time. And then people can sustain that. So that's one approach we're doing. That's just looking at the social dynamics of the group and saying, this can change. And if it changes, it's going to be a much more positive place for people to work.
I really love that approach of social dynamics. One question that I have is, of course, as you were talking, I could not stop myself but think of what I would describe as the superstar toxic leader, meaning that incredible rock star who is the driving force of the company across any industry, who has a track record of success, who is a bright star in their field, absolute wealth of knowledge, force of nature, but also very, very stressed and stressful to be around, and has a tendency to drive their team out of fear and sometimes can display anger, can display short-tempered. I've seen a lot of those leaders and worked very closely with many of these leaders, and I found that quite naturally, they often are the most resistant to, as you say, this family therapy in a work group setting, or even admit that they may be somewhat the source of the stress in the organization. How do you recommend that work groups, communities, colleagues approach these leaders? And how would you approach a leader like that?
Well, again, it is not simple. I certainly agree with that. But I think that basically it becomes down to thinking about what's the nature of the work that this organization is doing, that your work group is doing. Is it one where can that star in and of themselves carry the whole game? Is that really enough? And if it is, well, then you really have to be nice to that star, I guess. But usually with work groups, you need other people. You need, it's an organization because there really is a shared undertaking that's happening here. It's not just a one-person show. And I think that, and that with recruiting the best people these days, that best people have a limit of how much of that kind of stuff they'll put up with. And you're going to lose people in that kind of environment. You lose them, with them actually quitting and leaving, but also lose them in terms of, if they stay, in terms of their enthusiasm and their capability. So you're going to say that kind, indulging that comes at a particular cost. Because how I look at it is that often a lot of problems with work groups are attributed, to an individual. This individual was behaving badly, and that is the problem with the group. And I sort of look at it, sort of turn it around and say, the problem's not so entirely, that person is certainly carrying responsibility for their own behavior. But a critical part of this is that the group tolerates that behavior. That behavior can continue. And that when you do that, when you say people can be disrespectful to their colleagues, and we let that happen, and, there's no consequence for that happening, and we all just carry on, then you're saying that's the kind of group we are. It's not just that's the kind of person that is. This is the kind of group we are. We're one that accepts that behavior. And part of it is that the group gets to the point of saying, well, we're not going to accept that behavior. That is just beyond what we are about here. And we have some core values on this. And that's the piece. I guess when we've worked with, we've gone into some groups, when we look at that assessment that we do, we can see sometimes, the problem is all these little divisions and subdivisions and cliques within the work group that are fighting with each other. But sometimes it comes very clear in the data that the problem's coming from the manager of that group. It's the manager that a lot of people are having trouble with. And when we see that in the data, then we start with some coaching sessions for that individual manager and just go, in this, environment, in this industry, being a leader really requires engaging people, pulling out the best from people. If you're going to go somewhere really in this organization, you got to have demonstrate that you can do that you can be that kind of a leader. You can be that kind of responsive, transformational kind of leader, because that's what we're looking for, and that's what's going to advance you in your career here. And when you do that and show them the data and say, you're coming across a really different kind of way to your people, this is how they're seeing you, we find that for the most part, people say, yeah, I'm going to change that. I'm going to work. Yeah, we can work with you. We can work with you on how to change that. And then get them ready so that now they're ready to lead, be part of, participate in a group process where the whole group's trying to improve its culture. But that takes some careful listening. It takes bringing people along and confirming people who are the manager of the group that we're not trying to undermine you here. We're trying to actually put you into a much more sustainable kind of mode of being a leader for this group. So it's a big process, but it does work when you hang in there. And most people want to be, liked and admired, or at least admired. So you can just say that's part of being a leader now, and that's something that we're going to help you do and help your group rise to that level.
Well, Dr. Leiter, I actually have a question here, because you said that word, which I believe is very important, but is also quite controversial amongst leaders, to be liked. I hear a lot of my rainmakers and industry leaders say things like, well, I don't care about being liked. I just want to make sure that the team does what I need to be done, or fulfills their purpose, or is on top of their game, right? So sometimes there is almost a, dare I say, fear by the leader that being liked is somewhat softening their authority or their power, and comes with the risk of being too friendly or too casual. Can you give us your expert view on that, and whether or not these leaders are right or wrong to think so?
Oh, I think that being liked in a more, sort of superficial kind of way is not really necessarily a good objective for leaders. Like, you do change the nature of collegial kinds of relationships in organizations do change when people are in an authority position, and they need to be, recognizing that and knowing that is, just being liked in a usual kind of way is to some degree not compatible with being in a position of responsibility in that way. But what is important is being able to get across to people that the work environment is something where it is going to be effective and functional and fulfilling for those individuals. So that is part of, which means that while they may not be liking, that they've got to recognize that the manager, the leader, is actually providing an environment that is fulfilling for those individuals. And that they the leader also, in the course of that, needs to be modeling behavior that they want other people to be showing when they're going through their work. And that kind of thing, both in terms of interactions with clients, interactions with colleagues, interactions with professionals and other domains, that there is a standard of behavior that really needs to be gotten across, and that managers, to some degree, there's dynamics that happen in just reciprocity in their interactions with other people. If they're polite and respectful, people tend to be polite and respectful back. And so that kind of dynamic is working for a leader when they're interacting with people, members of the team, just coming across in the way you want people to behave towards you and behave in general. But leaders also have an extra level of symbolic kind of power in their behavior, because they're representing, even on a small level, but certainly when they're on higher echelons and on a more grand level, the values of the organization, what really matters here in terms of how people comport themselves. So that kind of symbolic quality to leaders' behavior is important as well. So how they comport themselves, if they're losing their cool, being rude, being disrespectful. That is something that they are giving permission for other people to doing. And that can come back to bite them. You can end up with a lot of problems if you've got a team who are behaving badly in that kind of way. So I think it's, so being liked, but behaving in a way that's really admirable and fulfilling and, connects with people is an important thing to be doing as a leader.
Thank you for this answer. Very interesting. Definitely took a lot from that. I do wonder whether we could take almost a case study example and think of a member of our audience listening today who is a leader who actually wants to make sure that their team is not burning out and is really interested in all your knowledge and insight and deeply cares. And let's say that leader, we'll call him Jeff for today's purposes, wants to get a sense of where his team is at and wants to almost, check the temperature in the room and wants to get a sense for who might be prone to burnout, who might be on the spectrum, who might be more susceptible. What would be a good first step for Jeff to take? And can a leader spot those early signs in a team? And what is a leader's role and responsibility vis-a-vis those early signs of burnout?
Okay, that's a number of things there. I think
that's a lot to
in
unpack.
terms of yes, okay, I will unpack here a bit. So in terms of assessing the situation, we work with a company called Mind Garden, and they use the burnout scale that we developed. That is also areas of work-life scale, and another one for social dynamics at work. And so they do online surveys of workplaces, and they're very good at it. They run it very smoothly, and they can provide reports then to an organization that covers the whole organization. They can then do reports on each of the departments within the organization, so they get the different components of it. And they also can provide individual feedback to each person who's completed the survey on where are they scoring relative to their norms, to the organization as a whole, on the burnout scale, on their mismatches on any of those 6 areas of work life, and other measures that are in the survey. So that gives the leader both information for the place as a whole, for each of the components, if some of them are having more difficulties than others, because you want to focus where the issues are, but also gives each individual some feedback and some insight into their own situation. So that's a particular, we find that's a very useful kind of thing. And I work sometimes with organizations in digging into that data a bit more deeply, and, because there's a lot of information there that often managers just don't know what to do with all of it, so you can sort of shape it up a bit more there. I also have people write out written comments. I know there was sometimes people just go on and write quite a bit about how they view the problems within the organization and what it is that's important to them. So you get that kind of information, and it can be really valuable that way. And again, where I've encourage people to focus, leaders to focus, managers to focus, is more on the work group kind of level, because managers aren't psychotherapists as a rule. That's not really their skill set, is working with people on their emotional problems. What managers are good at doing is managing. So I like them to really focus on where are the mismatches in terms of, are they workload issues that people are just finding that they just are totally swamped all the time. They're always behind the game. There's always too much pressure. Is it a workload issue, or is it a control issue that people, I could manage this workload if I just had more latitude in where I work and how I work and who I work with and when I work. If I had more flexibility there, I could get a lot more done. Is it a control issue in that way? Or is it that community kind of thing we were talking about? Or is it a value conflict? I've have all this work to do, and I really don't believe in it. I think it's actually harmful what we're doing. I can't really put my heart into this anymore. I'd really rather be working on a whole other project that seems much more in line with what I would think is important. So what kind of thing is it that is happening within your work groups? And then that becomes a problem that you sort of try to work out on the work group kind of level, that what's happening here. Like I was doing one survey with a hospital, and like a value conflict kind of thing was, people thought that they were perceiving that the upper management was just concerned with finances and expanding the organization, making it bigger and grander and all of that, where their concern was just on patient care. I want to take care of this patient and I don't care about their grand plans for expanding things. So that wasn't just one individual. That was sort of a broadly held kind of conflict within the organization. And basically there's gap had developed between the kind of executive level planning for the organization and the day-to-day work of the people who were the substance of the organization. The leadership wasn't bringing these people along with them. They weren't seeing how their grand plans were going to really help do better service to the clientele. It was really a gap there, and that was then became an impetus to pause things in terms of the grand plans and bring people along with that, and to do a whole lot more conversations and consultations with the people providing treatment throughout the organization to see what did they think was really going to make things more effective, more fulfilling in their work, more effective in terms of their core values of providing, the best possible service to their clientele. So that becomes, that alerted them that was one of the things that was really driving burnout within this number of sectors within this organization. And it became a problem then they could focus on that way. And it wasn't saying, okay, well, you need to relax more. No, we need to understand each other better. We need to be aligned in our efforts that we're working on here. So that's the kind of thing that you've got to listen to it. You've got to understand what's going on with these people. Why are they saying we're just all obsessed with money and get offended? You got to go, they're not with us. Right? There's a gap here. And the managers are in charge of communications in that way. That's their job, is to bring people along and to promote a shared vision of things. So I like managers working as managers and doing management solutions to these kinds of problems.
Mm. And how much do you think a manager or a leader can do in terms of that value congruence piece? Because I know that's something that you talk about and something that I find absolutely paramount in the burnout prevention equation.
Yeah.
Yet sometimes not done very effectively. We sometimes see organization putting a few values on the walls, but then you wonder if any of those are read or really embodied. Where do you think is the gap between sort of display of value and embodiment of value, and what can leaders do to bridge that gap?
Yeah, that gap is very big. And part of it is just an inherent kind of gap in that the way, a person, providing services thinks about those values is going to be different than how a upper level manager thinks about those values. Like what they do, who they talk to, how they go spend their time and day-to-day work life is just so different and at a different level of specificity and reality. So that is part of what's going on there. I think that when you get to the values piece, there are a couple of points that really make a difference, one of which is some degree of flexibility. I think that within a hierarchical organization, there needs to be more capacity at sort of the first line management to accommodate individuals with their distinct take on their values on these things, and to be able to talk to them, listen to them, talk through, and find work that really aligns better with their values, and to also to explore ways in which a particular project that they're working on, to talk through more deeply. What are the implications for this, for the kinds of things that we agree are important, that you think is important, that the organization agrees is important? Think about it that way more, to talk through those kinds of things rather than just say, well, it's obvious, but when it's not. So I think that's something, but I think part of a lot of these solutions come down to first line managers being able to have more prerogative than usual so that they can accommodate to what really is happening on the ground within their domains.
Mm. And what role do you think HR, heads of HR have to play or can play in large organization? Because what I see more and more nowadays is a very heavy involvement from and by HR to roll out workshop initiatives, to roll out burnout prevention measures. What is your take on the role that HR can or could play in burnout prevention across different organizations?
Well, I think they definitely have a role to play, though. I see, again, it's more dealing with this work itself and being able to have a model for, people working here, those basic psychological motives that we talked about, this idea that individuals are bringing values and that they're, being able to guide more and how that can be fulfilled within the workplace. I think doing, too much of sort of workplace health initiatives, look like helping people put up with the situation they find themselves in rather than improving the situation they find themselves in. And I think that there's a lot of modules and training that are they're just not that particularly useful to people. And I think that they really need to be thinking through, anytime you're taking up people's time and taking it away from their core work that they're actually committed to, that there's a real cost in that, and that the benefit really needs to be pretty obvious. Some of these initiatives are really just sort of covering off liabilities. There's some checklist that says we need to have a module on this particular issue, and it's not actually really a particularly effective way to change things within the workplace. So I think there's some limitations there and some possibilities, but really HR needs to be thinking more about how the work is designed and how it's being carried out, rather than just sort of people, recovering from and trying to find some respite from the difficulties of that work.
Mm. I'm glad you've mentioned that, and I found as well in my experience working closely with those organizations, the biggest shift you can usually make is when you start working on a one-to-one or very closely with the group basis, and you can really get into the details of all the underlying potential issues and challenges that may be the root cause in the potential burnout that the team in question is facing, as opposed to any sort of cookie cutter or global program that won't go into the detail and the dynamic of the team or the organization. And that's really important. And there is a role to be played in terms of giving employees and leaders that level of support on a one-to-one basis.
It's very important. I think becoming increasingly important because, the people entering the workforce now are much more value driven, have much more of a sense of themselves, and are more willing to walk away from a bad situation than generations before. So I think that being able to engage and maintain engagement from millennials and Gen Z and on, it requires a lot more listening. Boomers, they put up with most anything when they started working, but it ain't that way anymore at all. It's a much more sensitive kind of thing. And it makes, I think overall, it makes for a better workplace, but it does need to be managed in a different kind of way. And listening, like you were saying, is a critical piece of this.
Dr. Leiter, I want to go into that with you because I'm glad you've mentioned this boomers and this generational issue, because I see this more and more in organizations I work with, whereby quite seasoned leaders of a generation would say, well, we had it hard. We were working the hard way. And there is a level of
Yeah.
expectation that because I did it that way, that's how the younger generation should have it done. And then they're faced with a big pushback and a new generation that sometimes is being labeled as not hardworking enough. I've heard that quite a lot from seasoned leaders that I've worked with.
Yeah.
What is your take on this generational gap and the different culture and mindset around work ethics and work enthusiasm?
Oh, right. I think that, well, in many ways, the shift has been towards a more human-oriented kind of value structure for workplaces, and a lot of places are catching up with that. Some places can figure that out, and as you said, there are others who are saying, no, they should be working. I don't want to make that shift, but if you don't make that shift, you're not going to take the new workforce along with you, because I do think it is really different. The whole value structure associated with work had a major change. There were serious problems with how the previous generations of workplaces were structured. And, the shift in terms of, particularly in organizational psychology, it started off with things to make workplaces more physically safe. And when people in early factory kind of work were being killed and injured seriously, and making rules that stopped that kind of thing, controlled those kinds of physical hazards. And more, it's looking at, well, then psychological hazards, the really bad abusive kinds of stuff that would happen to people psychologically, and making rules. But now it's really looking on the more forward-thinking kind of thing about making workplaces that are more fulfilling, not just not hazardous physically, not just not hazardous mentally, but actually it's a responsibility, it's an expectation that this workplace is going to be fulfilling, not just, tolerable. And I think that is the nature of how, civilization has been developing, and leaders need to embrace it rather than sort of drag their feet and heading in that direction.
Yes. Well, because we are on the topic of generation, there is one more thing I would like to explore with you, and it's the academic burnout. What I mean by that is I've noticed, especially post-pandemic, a lot more students than ever before, top students, very ambitious students at top university, facing burnout symptoms and being completely overwhelmed, completely overstressed, and having very much all the signs and symptoms of what a young professional would have when coming into their profession, but instead of having it while they are in their profession, having it while they are in the library and studying. And it very much happened to me as well when I was studying. And I would love your take on that. Well, what do you think about this academic burnout and this idea or notion that very ambitious students can be quite prone to burning themselves out early on?
Right. Well, I think it's certainly, it is certainly there, and people have developed, versions of the burnout inventory that are particularly worded for students and how it's happening within student life. I mean, burnout is this idea, again, you can get chronically exhausted from any kind of activity that's sort of a major activity, takes a lot of your time and energy, and continues over a long period of time. You can start off loving something and get so tired and frustrated that you stop loving what you are doing and become really sort of cynical and withdrawn from it. And you can have experiences that really discourage you and say, actually, maybe I'm not really good at all this, which can be very discouraging when you're putting so much time and energy into it. I think the thing about the student life that's a particular vulnerability is that it doesn't have boundaries in terms of, well, when do you stop working and now you're on personal time? I think that's happened with workplaces overall, and it's very much part of the life of a student. Students can figure out, the ones who are not quite so ambitious and not quite at the top, whatever, they figure out, well, what's the least I can do and still make it through here? And some students are good at that, and some guess wrong. But some of them have got that figured out. But on the top end, it's sort of like you can always put in more time. You can always read another article. You can always, memorize another list. You can always do a bit more. And when you're aiming for the very top of the heap, that it's hard to find a lid until you fall asleep. And then there's on top of that, for a lot of students who have a social life, the social life of being a student is pretty demanding too, in terms of the time goes late into the night, not really good for sleep. Not really good for sleep. Could go into some substance consumptions and things like that wear down your energy as well. So there's a lot of dimensions around the student life that can really eat away at that core energy. And it's really hard to have a lifestyle that sustains things. So it is definitely a vulnerable kind of time, and there's been a lot on of studies with burnout with medical residents, particularly, was there in that in-between kind of place. They're through medical school, but they aren't really physicians yet, and they usually have the worst time schedules of anybody in the profession.
And if we had someone in that situation listening to us today, would there be a key message of encouragement you would like to share?
Well, the key message for that is you've got to find some place to recover your energy. The idea isn't that you should prevent getting exhausted all the time, but if you're going to get exhausted some of the time, if you're going to really push yourself to the limit, you have to have a recovery cycle. You've got to have, how are you going to get your energy back? Because that you don't have enough stored up energy to last the whole way through university year. You've got to have something built into your life where you are getting, you've got to carve that out and make the sacrifices and make the adjustments that you've got to make in order to carve out some period of time where you're going to recover by sleeping, by having fun, but doing it in a way that you come out of it saying, now I'm ready to take this on again.
And this key message is universally applicable across all high achievers, right? Finding this moment and setting a strong boundary to actually have that recovery cycle is one of the most, if not the key step to prevent burnout effectively.
Yeah, and it's a serious part of that whole plan. That whole plan of being at the top of the game is how you're going to sustain yourself at the top of the game, because it's quite a ride.
Indeed. Dr. Leiter, I am immensely grateful for all your knowledge and insight. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Could you perhaps invite our audience to connect with you and let them know what would be the best place to do that?
Okay, yes, please. I've got a website called mplighter.com, and there is an email address of lighter.cord@gmail.com, and you can find me there too. So love to hear from you, and find that way of sustaining a very productive and fulfilling work life.
I really appreciate that so much, and I'll be sure to include all those resources in the show notes. Thank you, Dr. Leiter.
Okay, thank you.
thank you for spending your time with me today and listening to this episode. Remember to subscribe so that you can receive weekly updates. And if today's message resonated with you, please remember to share it with a friend, a colleague, or a loved one who could really benefit from this episode.